Hi, this is Erica Merrill, and I'm the founder of Perfect Legal Video. And I am very excited to have with us today attorney Jenny Mihalovich. She is an attorney out of the Stewart Law Group in Phoenix, Arizona. And although she does everything that has to do with family law, she does have a really cool specialty. And we're going to talk a little bit about a topic that she knows a lot about. And so that is going to be child support. And I want to thank you so much for joining us for your first time on the show, Jenny.
Thank you, Erica. I appreciate you having me here today. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Absolutely. We're so excited. And I'd love for you just to tell me a little bit about what you were telling me earlier about your background, if you can put it together in a nutshell, and why you happen to have a much deeper well of knowledge than most people on the child support issue.
Of course. The first 16 years of my career, I was an assistant attorney general in the Division of Child Support Services, which is part of the Attorney General's office representing the Department of Economic Security, which at the federal level is similar to the Department of Health and Human Services. The Attorney General's office represents state agencies and through that represents all of the people of the state of Arizona. So in that capacity for 16 years, I represented the state in child support proceedings, all aspects of child support proceedings, from establishment of paternity, establishment of child support orders, modification and enforcement of child support orders, initiating and responding to court orders or requests to establish court orders across state lines. I did that for 16 years. In that capacity, I did a lot of training, both in-house for Attorney General staff, as well as outside of the agency. About actually 5 years ago today, I left the Attorney General's office and started here at Stewart Law Group. Most private attorneys, even if they have spent some time in public domain, they don't stay very long. They get trained and then they head out, or they're lifers. And so I'm kind of a unicorn in that regard, in that I was there for a very long time and have sort of a more intimate knowledge than the average attorney is to sort of the behind the scenes and the goings ons regarding child support. Most currently, I sit on the committee and the work group that established the child support guidelines for the state of Arizona. In that capacity, I also do trainings regarding current child support guidelines, as well as best practices for example, the State Bar of Arizona. And so I just have, that narrow experience where maybe other attorneys who've been practicing for 21 years, like I have, may have 21 years of, a wide breadth of topics. I have 16 years of a very focused topic that really comes in handy for both my clients, but also for my colleagues, because I still do a lot of trainings outside of the office for other attorneys on this issue.
And it sounds like they are lucky to have you because that is a huge amount of experience. So I have told you a little bit about myself. I went through a divorce last year, and I just remember the first time I sat down with my family law attorney that was going to help me through that kind of a sad journey that people go through, but for some people it's a really happy journey. Once they're done, it's certainly a reason to celebrate. And I know there are so many questions when people sit down, and so many of us that are not attorneys, especially in this specialty, we feel stupid because you might have been taken by surprise, or maybe you knew it was coming for a long time, but there's a lot of secrets, and sometimes you don't know what your assets are and what income is coming in the household, and there's a lot of surprises. And I know one of the first worries that people have, and maybe why they take a while to actually take steps to go toward a divorce, is they're just not sure how they're going to support themselves and their children. And so child support is a way for the the person that is not making as much to still be able to live after the divorce is final. And I'm just wondering if you can give us an idea about, child support and really how it's calculated. And I know it might be even different out there in Arizona than it is in other places.
It is different potentially state by state. There's really two predominant models. One is just a percentage of income of the paying parent. That's fallen into disfavor over the 20 plus years that I've been doing this. And in Arizona, we use what's called the income shares model. And that's the most widely used and accepted model. What that means is that parents are responsible for children financially on a pro rata basis in proportion to their percentage of the combined income. The idea is that the child or children should be in the same position as they would have been in if the parents had remained together or lived in the same household. And people who generally live in the same household pool their resources. So if you have, dad making $20 an hour and mom making $20 an hour, then theoretically they're each paying 50% of the expenses, whether it's the mortgage or food for kids. If you have one person making $40 an hour and the other one making 20, then presumably that person is paying twice as much of the expenses. Now, that's not always true, but that's the presumption that underlies the income shares model, is that the parents' contributions should sort of match their proportionate or pro rata share.
And that makes a lot of sense. It seems like it's a fair way to disperse the expenses of having a child.
I think it is. I mean, I've been doing this for 21 years and I've heard of a lot of different proposals from a lot of different interest groups on ways to change it or ways to make it better, because there are certain flaws in the system, especially when you start talking about people who have children with multiple other people. This particular model, it doesn't address that very well. And so people have tried to come up with other ways to do it that would maybe embrace more of that sort of new family that a lot of people have. And I haven't seen a good working model. So this model is gross income, not net income, because there's a lot of fiddling that can be done with net income. And the only way to eliminate that is to just use gross. And it's a very, very strict formula. It is an Excel spreadsheet, so it only takes numbers. It doesn't take words. You don't get to say, but it's just $10 an hour, $20 an hour, $50,000 a year. You can put it in monthly, you can put it in weekly, or you can put it in annually, and it shoots out a number at the end. And the idea is that children in the same position should be treated the same. So if the children in this household have a mom that makes $20 an hour and a dad that makes $20 an hour, this is what the child support's going to be. And that any other house on the block with that same financial distribution would have the exact same child support. It really is. I mean, a lot of people will say that it's failing, but it really is attempting to make things as fair and as equitable as possible under the circumstances.
Right. I mean, and I like too that it's not about trying to gouge the other person or, get back at them for something that had nothing to do with the child. Their relationship is totally taken out of it. Like you said, it's numbers. There's nothing else. But I do have a tricky question for you, because there are people out there that may not have a job. Their job may have been solely to take care of the house and the child, which is a full-time job in a lot of cases. And sure, there's plenty of working parents that also run their households, maybe not well, because there's a lot of juggling to do. So you're almost lucky if you can afford to have a parent that does take care of that stuff. And certainly if you hired someone to do all that, it would cost you upwards of $50,000 to $100,000 a year. I think Oprah might have said. But what do you have to say about it If someone doesn't have a job and they're getting divorced and there are children, what happens with a child support calculation then?
Well, first, I would say those are the kind of cases where you want to have an attorney, because there are those gray areas. I would say the black and white are the people that work for someone else and they get a paycheck and they get a W-2 and, they punch their clock 40 hours a week. From there is a whole spectrum. The other end of the spectrum being, like you said, someone who's unemployed. But there is all manner of things in the middle of that spectrum: self-employed people, or people who work as independent contractors, or what we call 1099 employees. What the court does with that, or what the parties do to try to stipulate in that situation, really varies. Because, for example, if you have really young children where the cost of childcare has just gone through the roof, even if they have a college degree, if they went back to work, they'd be paying the same amount that they're netting. And in that case, it may work to everyone's advantage to just use zero income, because otherwise they're just working to pay the babysitter. However, in Arizona, we have a presumption. If you're over the age of 18 and you aren't on disability or incarcerated, you are presumed to be able to work a 40-hour work week at no less than our state minimum wage, which at present is $12.15 an hour. So oftentimes, for especially a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad, that children are school age, so that sort of crushing childcare isn't going to be an issue. They're going to be attributed income that at the very least will be minimum wage. I always tell my clients, if I were to decide to be a stay-at-home mom, they're not going to attribute me minimum wage. They're going to attribute me the earnings of an attorney with 21 years of experience. So there's no short answer to that question. And that's definitely one of the areas that when people are getting divorced, in Arizona, we have a very robust self-service access to justice system to try to help people who can't afford attorneys represent themselves. But this is one of the areas where having an attorney will really help you to navigate what the different options are, whether you're going to settle the case or whether you're going to have to go before the judge and make your argument.
Yes, I've definitely heard that too. And I know that I've heard of cases where, they used to make 60, 70, 80, $90,000 a year. It has not been the case for 7 or 8 years. Yet when they go through the divorce, they're still getting calculated in on what they used to make when they were a full-time professional. Do you see that quite often?
We do. And, there's pros and cons to that. It's, one bad apple spoils it for the whole bunch. And what has happened over time is people have, either in a spirit of animosity because of the divorce, or because they don't feel like they're getting their just desserts in other areas, financial aspects, will try to use child support as a way to line their pockets, and whether that means not working when they have the ability to work or underemploying themselves. And so we've really created a system that presumes that you are going to be able to make that income that you used to make 7 or 8 years ago. And it's up to you. You have the burden of proving that that's not true any longer. And one of the things to think about, because I represent both sides, I represent the paying parent and I represent the non-paying parent. So I can make good arguments on both sides of the coin, is that, personal lifestyle choices of one person are not the financial responsibility of the other person. So for example, a lot of times I will see, it's predominantly moms. I don't like to be sort of gender stereotyping, but it's predominantly moms who will marry someone else of considerable wealth or enough wealth where they can stay home, and now want to be attributed zero income or minimum wage, even though they left a job paying, say, $80,000 a year. And by doing that independent life choice to be a stay-at-home parent now with the second family, the prior other parent is saying, look, that increases my child support. Your decision to stay home is all yours. Do it, enjoy, go forth and prosper. But I shouldn't have to pay what is essentially a financial penalty for your choice that I had no say in. That's really different than a situation where parties that were a couple made the decision together for mom to stay home. And that payor was part of that decision and now wants to say, oh, that, she should get income. I don't care that she's been at home for 5 years. I changed my mind. I want her to go to work. So those two situations are treated potentially differently in the eyes of the court, even though really the net effect is the same, right? A mom who's staying home with her kids. So there really is a lot of, people think of it as being a very narrow issue that doesn't have a lot of meat to it. But as you can see, there are tons of little permeations and little left and right turns that can make two cases that on the outside appear to be very similar to be very dissimilar.
And that is so true. And that is why I think it's super important for someone to get an attorney if they're going through a divorce, because I think oftentimes people listen to what happened to their neighbor or their family member, or even what they see on TV, and they think, oh, well, I can't do this because of XYZ. Like, none of that is really based on your reality. There might be bits and pieces that are similar, like you said, but everybody has a unique situation and there are different strategies to handle each situation. So, I mean, I find that, what you're saying is, really hitting the nail right on the head, because, it is different and you need to understand like what your situation is and how you can get the best outcome for yourself and your child. So I have an interesting question for you. What if you have equal parenting time? Does that mean that there's no child support?
It can mean that. It really just depends on the facts and circumstances of the case. For example, in Arizona, we use an income shares model. And so arguably, yes, if you have equal parenting time and you have equal income, you're not going to pay child support. But most of the time, people carry private health insurance, for example. And if one person's carrying private health insurance for the child or the children, even though the parties have equal parenting time and equal incomes, the one parent is shouldering this financial burden that would have to be redistributed between the parties. In other circumstances, because it's an income shares model, if there's a discrepancy in income, then you may still have a child support order, even though you have equal parenting time. And the reason for that is that you don't want, or the state in creating our guidelines didn't want to have a situation where a child was, for example, living in poverty with one parent and living in a much more higher socioeconomic status lifestyle with the other parent. And so our state legislature and many of the others that have the income shares model believe that, some transfer of those financial resources for the benefit of the children is necessary, even when you have an equal parenting time situation. So I would say a lot of cases have no child support when they have equal parenting time, but there are a lot of cases that do have a child support order, even though there are equal parenting time orders in place.
Yeah, I mean, and that, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, like you're saying, that it's really about keeping as much the same for the child as possible. And, it's already hard enough on the children that have to go back and forth for them to have such a varying degree of change and environment when they go from one house to the other. So, I mean, I'm glad that they seem to think of everything when they come up with these So that's really great. So let me ask you, this is definitely an interesting question. I remember a friend of mine being worried about getting married to a gentleman who was a financial advisor, and I guess he did really well. And she had been divorced for a long time from her husband, but had really been putting off marrying this person for 6 years because she thought it was going to affect her child support because of what her spouse makes. So, I mean, is that a thing?
It can, but it's going to be an unusual circumstance. In your general day-to-day, when you have parents who separate, or maybe they were never together in the first place, they just, happen to have a child together, they are free to marry and go on and have full and successful full lives with new partners. And the new partner's wealth is not going to impact their child support, because the legal obligation for support is only between the parents. And so if you have, say, a mom who's a teacher, and so she makes $40,000 as a teacher, she could marry a millionaire, and still, for purposes of child support, they're just going to use her $40,000 a year income, because the idea behind the income shares model is that the child or children should be in the same position as they would have been in if the parents had stayed together. And so that third party's income wouldn't come into play. Where it comes into play is when you have a situation where the remarried spouse has a different lifestyle now than they would have had otherwise. So say that teacher decides to stop teaching and just be a stay-at-home mom, or to be a housewife. Then you could have a situation where the court has a couple of options. They can attribute her the income of her prior employment and say, okay, well, you used to be a teacher, you stopped teaching, but for purposes of child support, we're going to use that income as a placeholder to calculate the child support. Or they can what's called attribute you what is essentially gift income. It is the expense that spouse is bearing on your behalf. So, whether it's a mortgage or rent payment, utilities, that kind of thing, that can be used by the court as a benchmark. And it's not saying, oh, we're taking your new spouse's, $1 million a year and attributing that to you as income. What the court is saying is you are living with no expense because someone else is covering those expenses on your behalf. And therefore, as a placeholder for purposes of calculating child support, we're going to assign value to those things and attribute it to you as income. And so a lot of people liken that to using their new spouse's income, but that's not actually what's happening. And that, like I said, only happens in an instance where someone is not employed. Where they're employed, the court is going to use their own personal income.
I mean, that's great to know. And again, there they are taking care of the children, but also making sure that everything is distributed fairly, because you're distributing the expenses, you're distributing the liabilities and the income, and so it is really important that they look at those changes, but also they're not punishing someone for moving on and having a good life later, which is really great. We all have heard of another situation where everything gets settled by the court and you have the amount of child support that you're supposed to be paying or you're supposed to be receiving, and then something happens. I mean, it could be the fact that they don't pay their child support all of a sudden, and it could be for many reasons. Sometimes it's of no reason of their own. There was a pandemic, and some people lost their jobs or became underemployed because of that, and they couldn't pay. Well, but there are also people that are spiteful, and they'll be late and they'll be slow, and they'll go spend money in other areas and not have money to pay their child support. I mean, there's a lot of reasons somebody wouldn't do that, but still the person that relies on that child support to pay the bills, to keep the lifestyle the same for the child, is at a loss and under a lot of stress. And, there's a lot of terrible repercussions to that. So what happens when someone doesn't pay their child support? How can you get your money?
There's quite a few options available to an obligee to enforce the obligation. And even in pandemic type situations where it is understandable that payments are not being made, you still want to protect your interest. You still want to protect the money that's due and owing to you. Child support is a very unique thing. We got rid of debtors' prisons back in the 1800s. And so child support is unique in that it's the only debt that you can go to jail for not paying. And when I say that to people, I often get a snarky response of, that's not true. You can go to jail when you don't pay your taxes. Well, that's different. That's a criminal offense if you don't pay your taxes. So you're not going to prison because you didn't pay a debt. You're going to prison because you violated the criminal code by not paying your taxes. Child support is the only debt that you can go to jail for not paying. In terms of a debt hierarchy, whether it's someone in bankruptcy or whether it's just someone sitting at the end of the month with their little pool of money and what they're going to pay, it is the top debt. The only thing that supersedes it is tax debt. And so you have to pay your child support first. Child support in Arizona does not expire. It does not have a statute of limitations. You can't outrun it. I have had people call me whose children are in their 40s, saying, I just got this notice and it says I owe all this money. I can't possibly owe all this money and my child is 42. When in fact you can still owe it. So there are a lot of remedies available to get someone to pay the child support. And sometimes you're just trying to protect what's owed to you, to get a judgment, to make sure everybody's on the same page of how much that is owed. And other times you're trying to get the piece of a pie. So for example, in a bankruptcy situation, you want to make sure that your portion is protected. The other unique thing about child support is it's non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. And so as long as the appropriate notices are filed with the bankruptcy court, you can't get rid of child support debt by trying to claim a bankruptcy like you can for your other debts. So we definitely encourage people to talk to attorneys and to utilize the resources that are out there to protect that financial interest. And while attorneys may cost a little money on the front end, if they're protecting a long-term interest, and like I said, it never expires, it's worth it to protect it on the back end.
That makes a lot of sense. And it is funny. I tell this story a lot. I did get a call from someone that was sitting in debtor's jail for his child support. And it was an old manager that I hadn't seen for like 8 years, had no relationship with, but he was just sitting in jail calling every single person in his phone. And, a lot of times I hear that they put him in jail and miraculously the money shows up.
I have some stories from my time with the Attorney General's office that you would never believe. When I was at the Attorney General's office, the agency we represented was called the Division of Child Support Enforcement. The name has been changed to the Division of Child Support Services. So their focus is a little different now. But when I was there, the hard hammer of the law came down, and a perfect example is a hearing that I did where a gentleman brought his infant child that was with someone else, with a new partner, in a baby carrier, thinking, the sheriff can't take me away if I've if I've got this baby carrier, right? So we had the hearing, and the whole time, oh, I couldn't pay because I had this new baby. And, they get to lecture that, your old baby is just as important as your new baby. How much can you pay? I can't pay anything. I don't have any money. I used it all to spend on diapers, blah, blah, blah. And the court has a button. You can't see it. The court hits the button, and the sheriff's office comes in, and they come in the back of the courtroom, and they've got their handcuffs, and they're handcuffing the guy. And they had called someone in to take the baby, and it was like his mother or something. And when she got there and took the baby out of the car carrier, there was $9,000 under the baby's butt in the car carrier. So, the things that people will do, like you said, there's often money. There were a number of judicial officers back in the day that would tell litigants that were paying parents that hadn't paid, they had to take their wallet out and line their credit cards up on the bench where the court is there, and flip them over and call the 1-800 number on the back on the record while it was being, recorded, and find out what the available balance was and get a cash advance on each one. And that was the total that they had to pay to stay out of jail. So yeah, I can see your situation, that being something here in Maricopa County that would happen, where they said you need to tap into your resources. It's not up to the other parent to take out a loan to support the children because you didn't. It's up to you to find loans to get money to support the children. So that does happen. There are a lot of creative thinking judicial officers out there that will suggest those sorts of things to people.
And I think that's great, and they should write a book about it and make the person read it before the hearing. And that's another interesting point that you bring up. The judge saying, well, listen, you still have to pay for your first baby. I have heard that if you have additional children from another marriage, it doesn't take away the child support or lower the child support for the first child that you had, or the first two, or I'm not sure how it gets dispersed, but is that true in Arizona?
That's not actually accurate. It can be accurate. It's really going to depend. I will tell you that in my time as a public attorney, my record was one gentleman that had 53 children with 53 different women. And that's a situation that is very difficult under the guidelines of how to handle. And some ways it's actually easier though than the situation where you just have, for example, maybe one paying parent that has a set of children with parent, B, and a set of children with parent C. That's almost harder, because when you have 53, you just go like hands in the air, like, what are we going to do? Like, at what point, we've just lost complete control. But when you have maybe one child with two different people, or two children with two different people, it's a much more difficult problem to solve, because you can't throw your hands up in the air and you can't just say, oh, this is a lost cause. And so in Arizona, we have what's called a self-support reserve test. It's an amount of money that we have to leave the payor. And there's a spectrum. It could be that you have a situation where when you apply that self-support reserve test, there's $1,000 left for child support. And if that payor has two kids, each gets $500. If they have four, then they each get $250. And so it can be that the first child's child support is lowered by the paying parent having subsequent children with other people. But it's not necessarily going to happen. It just really depends on how many other people they have to pay and what their income resources are in the first place. But the idea, at least in Arizona, is to treat all the children equally. At the end of the day, if you have multiple parents with multiple children with multiple different people, they want the children to all be in the same position. And if that means that everybody only gets a little tiny bit, that's definitely better than saying the first one gets all of it and the ones after get none, because it's not their fault.
Well, exactly. And I cannot believe I've ever heard of a worse situation than what you said. I mean, I know somebody who became like one of the top scientists in his field, but he came out of absolutely nothing because his dad had something like 8 children or 7 children with the mom that he was married to, and then he had another 9 children with his mistress. And so all the children of the mistress ended up going through adoption agencies and having to live some pretty hellish lives if they didn't get adopted. And he just came out of the ashes and turned into just a really brilliant person that helps cure cancer and sees the stars and like all that stuff that scientists do. He's a big part of that. But a lot of his siblings did not fare so well. Criminal records and illegitimate children, and just living in squalor. So you just don't know, and there was nothing they could really do for all those children. He just really worked his way out of there. I don't know where he got the inspiration, but good things do happen to people even in rough situations. So I guess let's hope for the best for those 53 or 54 children.
Yeah, there was one missing that wasn't there. So yeah, it's a complex problem. And in fact, we just got done updating our child support guidelines here in Arizona, and a new set of guidelines will go in effect January 1st, 2022. So in like 6 months. And that was really one of the hurdles that we were really struggling with, because this income shares model, like I said, it's really hard in application when you have two parenting situations where you didn't stay with the other parent, because the model wasn't really built for that. So it does become difficult. And like I said, it's almost harder in the smaller number of children cases, because you feel like you should be able to do it in a way that's fair and equitable, versus the situations where you have like 10, 12 kids with all different parents, where you kind of walk into the situation thinking this square peg is not ever going to fit in that round hole, when there's just two sets of families, or 3 sets of families. The logical side of your brain is like, okay, there should be a way to do this. There should be a way to make this fair and equitable. And we try, like I said, a lot of people say we're probably failing, but we are definitely trying to create, and the court is trying to create a fair and equitable situation, not necessarily from the parent's perspective, but definitely from the child's perspective, that it's fair and equitable.
And, and I think that's great. So what if there is what seems to be a short-term or a long-term situation where a parent can't pay the child support, and it's something like they got injured and they have to heal before they can go back to work? Or sometimes people get even more serious health issues where they can't even go back to work. Sometimes they just lose their job, their high-paying job, and it takes them a while to get back to that level, if they ever get back to that level at all. Can you give us an example of what you need to do if a modification is needed?
Yes, in Arizona, we do have the capacity to do temporary modifications in Arizona. And during the COVID pandemic, the court was entertaining those on an expedited basis. But for the most part in Arizona, if you do not have what's called a substantial and continuing change of circumstance, you're not going to be eligible for a modification. It's just going to be a debt that you're going to owe. So say, for example, you work in a capacity that requires you to be on your feet. You're a hairdresser, you're a waitress or a waiter, and you break your foot, and you've got 3 months where you're not going to be able to work in that capacity because you can't be on your feet. the court is not going to modify your order. You're going to have a debt for those 3 months because you weren't able to pay it because you're not working. And when you get back to work, you're going to be expected to pay it back at that time. The enforcement remedies and enforcement mechanisms aren't going to kick in for situations like that. They're going to say, similar to maybe your credit card company or maybe your landlord, like, oh, I see you're in a bad situation. When you get back on your feet, figuratively, literally, then you start paying it back. The difference is if you have a more long-term situation. An example I often use when I'm teaching new attorneys is years ago, I had a situation where a paying parent, his job was that he was a cameraman for one of our local news affiliates here. And so, the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, he was there operating the camera. And, somewhere in 2003, 2004, this particular station went to all automated cameras, meaning that there wasn't a person holding the camera anymore. It was a computer operated, sort of voice activated, where it was all happening from a booth and there was a director and there wasn't going to be anyone holding a camera. And so this gentleman was laid off, and there was no hope that he would ever be able to get a job in the field in which he was trained in. He was in his mid-40s, and the profession that he chose was obsolete. And yes, he could go back to school or go back to some sort of retraining, but that was going to take some time. We have a nuclear power plant here in Arizona. I have had a case where someone got fired from the nuclear power plant. Well, we only have one. So if they fire you, you don't have anywhere else to go. Now, could this person have gone to California where they have one? Yes, but their children are here. And so, moving to the nuclear power plant in Northern California wasn't really an option. And so in situations like that, you can potentially qualify for a modification of your child support in the same way as if you have an increase in income that someone may be entitled to a change in the amount. What is important in Arizona is that you show a substantial and continuing change of circumstance, and those terms are not defined. So it is going to be a case-by-case basis on what qualifies to modify the order. And that's why having an attorney is important, because articulating that substantial and continuing change can be the difference between the court granting your request and denying it.
Well, I mean, and that's really good information to know. And again, great reason to get an attorney, because everyone's situation is unique to them, and you're going to need help navigating through. So I would suggest to anyone out there that has a family law matter to absolutely call the Stewart Law Group in Phoenix, get some advice, sit down and just see what the strategies might be, and then decide whether to go forward or not. I mean, they have great attorneys there. Jenny is amazing. And she can work a lot of magic in a lot of areas of family law. She just happens to be a little more of an expert than most people at child support. And so, we appreciate all of this great information today. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I know that the audience is enjoying finding out all of the gotchas that people don't always think about when they're just getting ready to embark on a divorce. So Jenny, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate your expertise, and I hope you come back again soon.
Thank you for having me, Erica. It was a lot of fun. I one of the things that I miss about being at the Attorney General's office is having the opportunity to teach. And I hope your viewers, walked away today with a little more information that they had when they started. And I would love to come back at your convenience. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I hope you have a wonderful day. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again real soon.